two. Welcome, everybody. I'm Greg Archer, and this is another edition of the Esalen interview. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have Christian de la Huerta with us, and Christian is an award-winning author, respected spiritual teacher, sought-after spiritual retreat facilitator, and co-founder of Soulful Power, offering transformational retreats and workshops, awakening participants to their deeper sense of purpose, empowering radical and internal shifts. Christian says, when participants can uncover and overcome long-held fears that hold them back, this is when they begin to truly experience joy, fulfillment, and living on purpose, which also allows them to become catalysts for our planet's spiritual and cultural evolution. I love that. Christian, welcome. It's so wonderful to connect with you here today.
It's great connecting with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being with us. Now, how has this time been for you? It's been a curious time for all of us. How has this time been for you? What have you been doing to remain grounded and connected with your extended community?
You know, the physical isolation part of it is not a stretch for me. I love my own company. I'm used to spending time alone. I'm basically introverted. So that part of it feels natural. What has been a stretch for me is having to pivot, having had to cancel all live events and having to then learn the technology and begin to offer online work, which answers your question. I mean, that's so I'm doing weekly gatherings, virtual gatherings that just an hour long. They include some teaching, some Q&A, a chance for people to connect. Then I always do a breathing practice, teach them a different technique. And then we end up with a guided meditation.
Well, that sounds very enriching and very generative.
Yeah, I think people are finding it, and it is for me. It is for me too, even though once I got over myself and my resistance to having to do it online, it's actually becoming fun.
Right, and I think that's sort of the irony in all this. Like, for years we've been discussing how technology, whilst very good and whatnot, has been sort of distancing us in a way. And now we are in this time where we're coming together thanks to our technology. So it's all a very curious mix. I recall reading that, during these stay-at-home mandates or shelter-in-place, you mentioned that the coronavirus is not the only thing that was contagious. And you mentioned that hope was also contagious. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. We were just, the gathering that I had this week, we were talking about fear. And how that is actually the fear that lives in us is actually worse than the situation. And I'm not minimizing the situation. It is a very serious, incredibly serious global pandemic. But in terms of the numbers to overall humanity, the chances are small that any of us are going to get it. And yet we've gone into this panic mode and toilet paper panic mode. So doing a lot of work with that, like what is fear, and what some of the fears are obviously healthy and adaptive, and they have kept us alive throughout human evolution. And then there's this whole other category of fears which are not adaptive, which stem from futurizing, right? How am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to survive this? What kind of a life will I have without toilet paper? And yet we worry about and become incapacitated by these events in our mind, which may or may not happen. So part of what I'm talking about that is, how do we maintain center? How do we remain the eye of the storm in the face of all the corona madness, right? In the world, the whole world is in panic mode, understandably. And so our job is like, how do we center ourselves? How do we remain, like here in South Florida, where I'm based these days, we know that there is nothing we can do about the storms, right? The storms are going to come, and the only thing we can do is prepare ourselves for it. And we know that the storm's going to pass. It's going to blow over. So this too shall pass. So how do we find our way to deal with it and to, like I was saying, to remain centered in the eye of the storm?
Yes, remain centered in the eye of the storm. That's right. That's right. So that might be one of the lessons that we might be learning from this. But are there other insights, or what do you feel is, if you were to think about that, the lesson that this time is attempting to teach us?
Well, I think in some ways it's, Mother Nature just had it and she sent everybody to the rooms like a global timeout.
Yeah.
And we're seeing already some benefits. And again, not to minimize the pain of it. Like there's going to be a lot of death, already is. And there's going to be a lot more death and tragedy and unspeakable grief. And some good will, of course, inevitably come out of it. So you're asking me about hope before. Fear and love, or fear and hope, or fear and gratitude cannot coexist, right? Only one can be in us at a point, at any given point. So we have a choice over the thoughts that we're having and over the emotions that are coursing through our body. So one of the blessings of it is that this mandatory global timeout is forcing a lot of us, to go within and to face ourselves and to face our fears and to get in touch with all the ways in which we have been avoiding ourselves and self-medicating to not think and to not feel, in all the multiplicity of ways that we self-medicate, whether it's chemical substances or sex or gaming online or work or exercise, all the ways, shopping, TV. So that's part of the blessing on the opportunity, right? The opportunity is like, how are we can't do anything about the global pandemic, but what we can do about is how do we show up in response to that? How do we take advantage of this opportunity?
Yeah, it totally resonates with me. Uh, how can we be in even more congruent relationship with one another now, during this time? Because a lot of us are isolated. So what are you discovering, or in what ways can we become or get closer to one another?
Yeah, well, in some ways, a lot of relationships are going to be transformed, right? And people are going to be forced to go deeper in relationship with each other. Some of them are not going to make it, right? So there's this forced physical confinement that many people find themselves in, or then people like me who, in a long distance relationship, are going to go for months without seeing each other. It's going to either help the relationship get deeper, or people are going to drift in separate ways, or just realize that what they've been running away from, that the fact that maybe they're not as compatible as they thought they were, is like, this is going to like shine a bright light on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned that human beings are hardwired to transform, but do you find that there's um, a resistance to that a little bit too? Like there's a fear in heading toward there initially, sort of like when a writer has a little bit of block when they start to sit before a page or a computer.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and we get into that in the weekend retreats that I do. Is like I do a lot of different retreats on different things, on relationships, doing relationships intentionally, consciously. If you are in relationship, how to then great, then you've got those basic human needs for love and intimacy and companionship and sex, maybe family and all that good stuff. Then what? How do we utilize that container to speed up our own process of healing and evolution, which is ultimately why we're here, as far as I'm concerned. And if you're not in relationship, how do we identify the subconscious ways in which we block ourselves from love, and in which we sabotage our relationships before we even get started by falling for the wrong people, people who are attracting people who are not available, who are not a match. I do stuff on personal empowerment. Like, how do we step into power in a way that's not hierarchical, about fear, force, manipulation, that doesn't require for us to step on anybody, push anybody down in order for us to feel powerful. I do specifically that work with women, coming from the conviction that the empowerment of women is the single most important thing that needs to happen in our world today, because to that, we can connect all the other issues that we face as a species. I do stuff on life purpose. I do the retreat that I do at Esalen that's LGBT focused, but common to all the retreat, no matter what the theme, is breathwork, because I've yet to come across any healing modality that heals as quickly and as profoundly and in so many ways, having done it for 30 years now. And the other thing that I always do is teach about the ego. So critical that we understand how that ego mind. And we don't have the time to get into all of that today. You know, for many people will already have an understanding of it. The way that I teach it is a different maybe facet of the prism through which to look at, very practical way of looking at it. But what you're asking is like, right, so we have this longing, the stadium part of us. Like a real simple way of teaching the ego is like, if we put a baseball in the center of the stadium, that's the ego, right? And that's who we think we are. Who we are is actually the stadium. So it's the personality part of us. So the stadium part of us always feels connected, right? It doesn't feel the separation. It's not limited by fear, whereas the ego, it's all about fear, right? So whether we step into our purpose, whether we, which is another whole conversation that we're having in these weekly series, is like, what are we going to place our trust on? Right? Are we going to place our trust on companies that are closing their doors on a daily basis, on a global financial economic system that is all made up, all illusion? We used to say that it was paper. It's not even paper. It's ones and zeros in a cloud somewhere. Right. So what are we going to place our trust on? And so the fear, the little part of us, the personality part of us is terrified. That's the part of us that's terrified. And so that's the part that resists growth, and the part that is terrified by anything that signifies change, even if that change is at best from a comfortable condition for most of us, 99% of us. At worst, miserable. That little ego mind doesn't distinguish, right? So anything that signifies change, even if it's positive and transformational and fulfilling, it's still going to be very threatening to that little part of us. So that's why we resist change, even if at some level we know change is good and necessary.
Yeah. Well, that just really resonates when you speak it, and I really feel it. What have you noticed within the LGBTQ community that has been either standing out either during this time, during COVID-19, or just in general? I know that your work involves like a call for LGBTQ heroes, and so I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and how you can help us maybe know about things we might not know about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do the call for heroes is for everybody, right? Like beyond any label. Like, to me, like I'm publishing this summer the first book of a series of 3. The series is called Calling All Heroes. Like, what does it mean to live heroically in the 21st century? When we don't have the horse hitched outside and the armors and the demons to slay, except the ones in here. So the first book is on personal empowerment, like we were talking about before. So the LGBT retreat has that general call for all human beings as we awaken to this. I've been saying for years that it's all hands on deck. Now it's really all hands on deck. So the interesting aspect of the LGBT is, like, my first book that was published like 20 years ago, Coming Out Spiritually. The premise of it is that it's really tragic that so many people in the LGBT community have rejected the spirituality because we confuse it with religion, right? And no wonder, given the treatment that we have received and continue to receive at the hands of most religions. But the ironic part of that, the tragic part of that, is that before the patriarchal cultures and religions and times, people that we today call LGBTQ, whatever we call ourselves, were not only spiritually inclined, but were honored all over the world for the roles of spiritual service and spiritual leadership that we played. Mm. So as far as I'm concerned, we're all spiritual beings, that are happening to have a physical experience for one time or many times, depending on your system of belief. At that level, it doesn't matter one bit, what's between our legs and what we do with it. So we all have that calling, and it's just as ludicrous to try to reject part of who we are, whether it's our sexuality, like many LGBT people, like I know I went through that phase of rejecting my sexuality because it was so forbidden by the religion in which I was raised. Equally nonsensical is to try to reject our spirituality. It's just part of who we are, right? And the thing about that is that as we reclaim that part of who we are, we get to define what that means and how we connect with that and how we express with that. And I've so many people, gay or straight or anywhere on that spectrum, that tell me, well, I don't believe in any of that. I'm an atheist. And then I say, well, depends on what you mean by God, right? If we're talking about an old man in the sky with long hair, white hair, and robes, and choir of angels, and a deity that's punitive and judgmental and a busybody, like micromanaging everybody's lives, then I'm an atheist too. Right? But that's not what the sacred is to me. That's not how I personally relate to the divine. And I think part of what's up for all of us, going back to the blessings and the opportunities of this time out, is reconnecting with our spiritual essence, whatever that means, however we connect and express that.
That's rich. That's rich. So, Christian, what does it mean to be a hero and to live heroically during these times, or in this time in the 21st century?
Well, it's interesting because we tend to, and the times are also expanding, right? Forcing all of us to expand that definition. Right. Like usually up until a few months ago, we asked any one of us what a hero is. We would probably, most of us would identify a warrior, or maybe a first responder type thing. Now we're expanding what that means to include doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists and grocery clerks, people who are placing their lives at risk to some degree in order to serve something greater. So to me, that's what most of us tend to identify as heroic. And again, now we're all of us having to redefine and expand what that means. What the book is about is helping us to connect with our own heroic essence, like the everyday hero that lives inside of us. Like, so maybe we're not going to be in a situation where we have to place ourselves physically at risk for the sake of something else or someone else. But the way that I recommend living about, like understanding the ego, understanding all its shenanigans, its tendency to be right, it's wanting to control everybody and everything, its projections, and reeling those projections back, turning the mirror around. If we're going to use relationships consciously, if it's there, it's here, right? And so doing all these practices that are going to help us get free from the self-imposed prison of the ego, that's heroic. Like the ego is all about reacting, right? Somebody does to me, presses one of my buttons, I react and press one of theirs or splatter them against the wall. Anybody can do that. We've done it 1,000 times. Taking a breath, like, ouch, that hurt. Bringing choice back into the equation. How do I want to respond to the situation? It's nothing short of heroic. It really is.
Mm, it's beautiful.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, when did you know for sure that you were going to do this work? When did it hit you that, oh yes, this is my life path?
Well, it's a good question. Um, I went to a Catholic all-boy Jesuit school. Um, so I always had this sense of wanting to serve the sacred. As I've understood it at different times, at that phase in my life, I thought I wanted to be a priest. And I think part of it was a legitimate, like an authentic calling. And I also think that it was a way, like subconsciously, that I thought, like, I really believe priests were celibate. So in my mind, that was a way that I could sublimate my sexuality that I was so deeply conflicted about. Um, trying to be who I was in a relation in a religion that told me that I was going to burn into hell for eternity. So having that part of me that wanted to serve, and yet being told by the religion in which I was raised that I was going to burn to hell for eternity. It's like, wow, talk about my adolescence was one huge, long depression. But I worked through all of that, right? And I found a way to connect with the divine in a way that works for me, right? And I draw from different spiritual traditions. Um, I think I lost my train of thought. What was the question
You're
again?
actually on a very good train of thought. No, we were talking about how you knew for sure that this was sort of your
Oh,
path,
yes,
and
yes, yes.
you were just very eloquent in how you were describing your formative years and whatnot. So yeah, I was really caught up in it. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
so I've always known. So I've always known, right? I've always had that part of me. I studied psychology. My dad was a psychiatrist. So, I thought I've always had this thing. And through, even as a kid, I was the kind of person that people came to me with their problems, even older people. Um, so I've always had that. And again, it's kind of manifested itself or been colored in different ways at different points. This particular um, part of my work, which I've been doing for 30 years, this facet of it, um, I connected with a spiritual teacher. Right during my 20s, I went through this kind of questioning phase where, like, of course, like no longer that the Catholic worldview worked for me. No, so I started to kind of focusing on my own personal growth, my professional development. By the end of my 20s, I was pretty successful. I had a nice, cushy job, a condo on the water, sports car, the Armani suits, handsome lover, sought after socially, professionally. And yet it seemed to me that the more I had and the more that I was sought after, the more that there was something missing.
Mm.
Like I remember thinking, there's got to be more. There has to be more. So I started looking again. I started searching again. Um, And right around that time, I just got connected with a teacher where I learned both breathwork as a healing modality, and where I understood and where I learned about the ego mind. And it's interesting that even with a psychiatrist father and going through college, I didn't really have an understanding of the ego. It's like, sure, I understood Freud's model of personality, the id, the ego, the superego, but not the way that I understood the ego, and the way that I teach it now, which is more derived from Eastern teachings. That's what I needed to know. Like, that's what I needed to know to understand why I did the things that I did and why I sabotaged myself and why I got caught in these repetitive patterns of behavior that weren't good for me in the ultimate run, in the ultimate analysis. So that shifted everything for me. Um, and then I knew, right, this is it. It's like, this is with the combination of those two things, breath work that heals more quickly than anything else I've come across. And I'm talking about serious psychological and emotional trauma. In 30 years of doing this, I've seen a lot of trauma. Like, we can talk about that for days, stories that I can share about that stuff. And yet it gets healed with the power of the breath. So with that practice and understanding the ego and its shenanigans, that's all we need to get free. I'm not saying that's the only path, of course not. But if you get those two things, you got what you need to
Yeah.
free yourself.
So for those of us who I do breath work, I meditate. For those of us that might be new to something like that, is there something that we can share with them? What would we need to know if we wanted to really begin exploring that?
You mean breathwork specifically?
Yeah.
Well, I have a TED talk, a TEDx talk of the power of the breath, which is a great way to begin to get the macro view of the breath. There's a lot of under the name of breathwork, there's a lot of different practices. Um, for people that come out of the yoga tradition, there are a lot of different types of pranayama,
Right.
and breathing practices. The breath work, what that means to me specifically is a particular type that is circular breathing, and there's different types of different modalities of that. You do it for a longer period of time. Most modalities are about an hour and a half. Some of them are as long as 3-4 hours. And it's amazing what happens, right? So in breathing in the circular, connected, kind of exaggerating the inhale, just amazing stuff happens. Not only does it heal, like in every sense that I can think of, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, even physically. And I know that sounds too good to be true, but I can't argue with 30 years of results and permanent results. It's not just like you have a great high, which people often do. Like they have amazing, profound, for lack of another word, spiritual experiences, like feeling one with everything, feeling as part of the cosmos, of some greater something. One thing's reading about it in a book, another one is feeling it at a cellular level. Um, people have loved ones who have passed show up with messages of forgiveness, of love, of understanding. People have divine visitations, and Buddha or Mother Mary or Jesus or the angels of different Ganesha, they show up in people's experiences. And yeah, part of me, like for years, I would say, well, that's just my misfiring brain neurons. And then I got to the point of like, you know what, even if it is, who cares? It works. But then what I can't argue with is that stuff that happens in a breathwork session then has evidence in physical reality. That, like, for example, recently, one that comes to mind, a woman that had a falling out with her grandmother for like 10 years. They hadn't spoken in like 10 years, and her grandmother was more like her mother figure. And I forget what caused the falling out. But after part of a retreat in which we do multiple breathwork sessions, I think it was the last one where she finally got to a place of forgiveness. That was on a Sunday. On Monday, the grandmother calls her. Like, how do you explain that? Like, I can't explain that. I don't think our science can explain that yet, right? It may someday.
Right.
But that we're interconnected in ways that we can't deny and explain, it's like, that's pretty clear to me.
Yeah, it's very deep and very profound. I think we hear that we are all one, we are all connected, but I think to really kind of grasp that and like to really, it's very deep. It's very deep stuff.
Yeah, it's life changing.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
changes
Wow.
everything. Because once you get that, once you experience that, um, like then you don't feel lonely anymore. Right? You don't feel you can't. That handles the abandonment stuff. Because even in a time of physical separation, you still feel a connectedness.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Yeah.
right. How would you define spirit?
Yeah, that's another huge question. Um, let me start with this. Religion, like the word religion that so many of us get stuck with or stuck by or triggered by. The Latin root of that word is religare, which means to bind or to rebind. In contrast, spirituality is from the Latin spirare. And from that same root, we get respiration and inspiration or expiration. And if you start looking over all the different traditions, spiritual traditions, and even some secular languages, that one word can mean spirit or breath. And so the same word can mean one or the other depending on context, depending on how we use it. That begins to give me a sense of what is ultimately ineffable and inexplicable. Right? So we can talk about an energy. We can talk about, a divine choreography. We can talk about DNA. We can talk about some kind of intelligence. Ultimately, I don't know that we really know what it is. But from my experience of it, my personal experience, it's not what I've read. Which, I mean, I have read, but it wasn't until I experienced it myself that I really began to get it. And yet, explaining it is you're always going to fall short.
Right.
Yeah.
So
but
true.
the breath spirit connection is an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, here's some fun questions maybe to round out this wonderful interview, and thank you for being so eloquent. So what brings you a real sense of wonder and awe?
Nature, for sure. Like if I were going to say my church, that's where I feel most connected, I would say nature. And whether, I mean, so that kind of beauty.
What happens for you there in nature?
What's what you're saying is that awe, whether it's in looking at a beautiful flower like this orchid behind me, or the majesty of a sunrise or a sunset, that sends me into that quiet place where I'm not even thinking. I can feel my heart center open. So you feel like that warmth. I feel that warmth in my heart. And a sense of gratitude that sometimes just brings tears to my eyes. So I can feel that in nature. I can also feel that in the presence of some humans. Like humans can be so incredibly cruel to each other, and we can be capable of the most profound beauty and generosity that also brings tears to my eyes. And even watching the news, these days, that can be heartbreaking. I have been moved to tears multiple times by acts like that of just generosity and courage, and these heroic humans who just go in there every day, knowing that chances are good that they're gonna get infected, working multiple shifts, day in and day out, and putting their sacrificing their time with their kids and their families. It just touches me in such a deep way.
Yes, I understand. So how has the work you've been doing in the world helped you expand your own human potential?
Yeah. It's, if I'm anything, I think what makes me a good teacher is that I walk my talk. So that's part of the reason that it's taken years between books, is because as I've been thinking about, I'm mulling over and writing about and testing stuff out in retreats about what it means to live heroically and stepping into power in a different way that comes out of spirit, like or developing relationships that can actually work, and having that it's like I'm doing it all myself, right? So I'm making sure that I'm putting into practice, that I'm living everything that I'm talking about. So it forces me, right? It catalyzes me to stay connected. It catalyzes me. I mean, I don't know if it catalyzes is the word, because I think I would be doing that anyway. Like, I often ask myself, like, what would I do if I won the lottery? And I would do exactly what I'm doing now. I would just do it with a lot more support and a lot more reach. Um, putting systems in place that would allow me to reach more people. But what I do, my work, my mission, is what gives me meaning, is what gives me purpose. It's what allows me to, just get up in the morning, is what helps me go to the gym when I don't feel like going to the gym. Because I know that's part of my job description.
Right, right. I
And
totally.
it sounds, and that also was a whole journey, because there was a huge chunk of my spiritual process where I thought, no, that's petty, and then I realized, no, you can't leave the body behind. We can't talk about transformation and ignore the body. It's got to be holistic and consistent and congruent.
Mm-hmm.
All of it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, one last question for you. What's the most interesting thing you've been learning about yourself lately?
Hmm. Hey, you're asking great questions. Hmm. Well, I think it would have to be that my cutting edge in the last month or so has been this whole thing about learning the technology to offer virtual programming, something that I've known for years I needed to do. So thank you, Corona, for finally forcing me to do it. Um, but my part of my cutting edge in that is seeing one more time how the ego keeps us in our comfort zone, right? And yeah, multiple layers and multiple examples of that throughout our lives. But I had gotten to a place where, yeah, I'm really good at what I do, and I feel like I'm gifted at what I do. In the live retreats in 3D, um, and then suddenly I had to pivot, and I had to, like, all right, well, how am I going to do this now?
Mm-hmm.
And then realizing that once I started doing it, that it wasn't the big deal that in my mind it was going to be.
Yeah, isn't
Like,
it?
yeah, the first online session was the first pancake. So what?
Yeah,
So what? Big deal. I survived it. Everybody else survived it. Everybody had good experiences once we worked out the technology.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when we get that nudge to, and this has been a big nudge for many of us, right? To go into places that we thought we might kind of explore, whether it's, an internal or all these other things. So,
So what about you? You answer that. What have you
oh,
learned about
what a
yourself?
great question. I think I will answer that. What was my, what's the most interesting thing that I'm learning about myself lately?
Yes.
Um, well, that I'm probably less in control than I really think, that there's something bigger. I'm relearning that. I think that there's something greater moving with me and through me and around me or something.
Good.
Um, and that so long as I don't tinker much with it or try to fiddle around with it and just basically show up with some good intentions, I'm not just show up with good intentions, but to show up and have good intentions and things things I move more smoothly through the world when that is the case, when I'm able to do that.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, a lot of times I trip and stumble, and have to get up. But that's the biggest lesson I'm relearning now, I think.
That's
Uh,
good. And
yeah,
the day that we stop doing that, tripping and stumbling and getting up, brushing ourselves off and getting up again, I think that's when we're dead.
right, right, exactly.
Yeah, so it's a good sign. It's a good sign that growth is happening, that evolution is happening.
Yes, right, right. Well, Christian, it's such a pleasure to connect with you. So thank you for your time. Really, thank you for your time and everything you shared. And to all those who are here watching, thank you for showing up and being here. You can learn more about Esalen's upcoming workshops at esalen.org/learn. Christian, is there a particular place you'd like to direct people to in case they want to learn even more about you?
Yes, my website is soulfulpower.com, and I can't wait to be back at Esalen again. Like one of my favorite spots in the world.
And talk about wonder and awe, right? So
Yeah. Oh my God, it's just magical.
that is definitely the case. Christian, thank you so much. And for everyone out there, be safe, be well, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.